We'll be reading in this series of the Book of Hermits. It's a collection of monks, and they provide with an insight of their lives, a life of wisdom and dedication to spirituality, dedication to become saints. We'll to share the table of contents. It includes the introduction, Saint Anthony's life, the life of Saint Paul, the first hermit, Saint Hilarion, Saint Arsenius, the hermits of Asia, Basil, Saint Simeon the Stylite, the hermits of Europe, Saint Severinus, the apostle of Noricum, the Celtic hermits, Saint Malo, Saint Columba, Saint Gottlob, and Saint Godric of Finchal, anchorite, strictly so called. So, at this time, we'll be starting the introduction of the Book of Hermits. Saint Papanotus used to tell a story which may serve as a fit introduction to this book. It contains a miniature sketch not only of the social state of the Egypt, but of the whole Roman Empire, and of the causes which led to the famous monastic movement in the beginning of the 5th century after Christ. Now, Papanotius was a wise and holy hermit, the father or Abba or Abbot of many monks, and after he had trained himself in the desert with all severity for many years, he besought God to show him which of his saints he was like. And it was said to him, "Thou art like a certain flute player in the city." Then Panutius took his staff and went into the city and found that flute player. But he confessed that he was a drunkard and profligate, and he till lately got his living by robbery, recollected not having ever done one good deed. Nevertheless, when Papanotius questioned him more closely, he said that he recollected having found a holy maiden beset by robbers, and having delivered her and brought her safe to town. And when Papanotius questioned him more closely still, he said that he recollected having done another deed, which he was a robber. When he was a robber, he met once in the desert a beautiful woman, and she prayed him to do her no harm, but to take her away with him as a slave, whether he would, for he said, I'm fleeing from the apparatus and the government's curio for the last 2 years. My husband has been in prison for 300 pieces of gold, which he owed as arrears of taxes, and has been often hung up and often scourged, and my 3 dear boys have been taken from me, and I'm wandering from place to place, and I have been often caught myself and continually scourged, and now I have been in the desert 3 days without food. And when the robber heard that, he took pity on her and took her to his cave, and gave her 300 pieces of gold, and went with her to the city, and set her husband and her boys free. Then Panutius said, I never did a deed like that, yet I have not passed my life in ease and idleness. But now, my son, since God has had such care of thee, have a care for thy own self. And when a musician heard that, he threw away the flutes which he held in his hand, and went with Panutius into the desert, and passed his life in hymns and prayer, changing his earthly music into heavenly. And after 3 years he went to heaven, and was at rest among the choirs of angels, and rank of the just. This story, as I said, in a miniature sketch of the state of the whole Roman Empire and the causes why men fled from it into the desert. Christianity had reformed the morals of individuals. It had not reformed the empire itself. That had sunk into a state only to be compared with the worst despotism of the East. The emperor, whether or not they called themselves Christians like Constantine, knew not law, save the basis maxims of the heathen world. Several of them were barbarians who had risen from the lowest rank merely by military power, prowess, and who, half maiden by their sudden elevation, added to their native ignorance and brutality the pride, cunning, and cruelty of an Eastern sultan. Rival emperors or generals who aspired to be emperors devastated the world from Egypt to Britain by sanguinary civil wars. The government of the provinces had become altogether military. Torture was employed. Torture was employed, not merely as of old against slaves, but against all ranks, without distinction. The people were exhausted by compulsory taxes to be spent in wars which did not concern them, or in court luxury in which they had no share. In the municipal towns, liberty and justice were dead. The curios, who answered somewhat to our aldermen, and who were responsible for the payment of the public money, tried their best to escape the unpopular office, and when compelled to serve, wrung the money in self-defense out of the poor inhabitants, by every kind of tyranny. The land was tilled either by oppressed and miserable peasants, and by gangs of slaves in comparison with the whole lot that even of the American Negro was light. The great were served in their own households by crowds of slaves, better fed, doubtless, but even more miserable and degraded than those who till the states. Private profligacy among all ranks was such as cannot be described in those or in any modern pages. The regular clergy of the cities do not of profligate lives, and for the most part, in accordance with the public opinion, unmarried were able to make no stand against the general corruption of the age, because at least if we are to trust such writers as Jerome and Chrysostom, they were giving themselves up to ablution, ambitions, and avarice, vanity and luxuries, intrigue and party spirit, have become the flatterers of fine ladies, silly women laden with sins, ever learning and never coming to the knowledge of the truth. Such a state of things not only drove poor creatures into the desert, like the fair woman who the robber met, but it raised up bands of robbers over the whole of Europe, Africa, and the East, men who, like Robin Hood and the outlaws of the Middle Ages, getting no justice from men, broke loose from society, and while they plundered their oppressors, kept up some sort of rude justice and humanity among themselves. Many too fled and became robbers to escape the merciless conscription which carried off from every province the flowers of young men, to shed their blood on foreign battlefields. In time, too, many of these conscripts became monks, and the great monastics of Asitis and Nitra were hunted over again and again by officers and soldiers from the neighboring cities of Alexandria in search of young men who had entered the spiritual warfare to escape the earthly one. And as a background to all this seething heap of decay, misrule, and misery hung the black cloud of the barbarians, the Teutonic tribes from whom we derive the best parts of our blood, ever coming nearer and nearer, waxing stronger and stronger, learning discipline and civilization by serving in the Roman army. Alternately, the allies and the enemies of the emperor rising, some of them, to the highest offices of state and destined, so the wisest Romans saw all the more clearly as the years roll on to be soon conquerors of the Caesars and the masters of the Western world. No wonder if that in such a state things there aroused such violence contrary to the general weakness, such eccentric protest against the general weakness, as may be seen in the figure of Abud Pabnutius, when he compared either with a poor man tortured in prison for his arrears of taxes, or with a governor and the officers who torture him. No wonder if in such a state of things the mind of man was stirred by a passion akin to despair, which ended in a new and grand form of suicide. It would have ended often, but for Christianity in such an actual despair as that which had led in past ages more than one noble Roman to slay himself, when he lost all hope of the Republic. Christianity taught those who despaired of society, of the world, in one word, of the Roman Empire and all that it had done for men, to hope at least for a kingdom of God after death. He taught those who had they been heathens and brave enough would have slaved themselves to escape out of the world, which was no place for honest men, that the body must be kept alive, if for no other reason, at least for the sake of the immortal soul, doomed according to his works, to endless bliss or endless torment. But that the world such, at least as they saw it then, was doomed, Scriptures and their own reason taught them. They did not merely believe, but see, in the misery and confusion, the desolation and the degradation around them, that all that was in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life, was not of the Father, but of the world, that the world was passing by, and the lust of thereof, and that only he who did the will of God could abide forever. They did not merely believe, but saw that the wrath of God was revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness of men, and that the world in general, above all, his kings and rulers, the rich and the luxurious, were treasuring up for themselves wrath, tribulation, and anguish, against a day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man according to his works. That they were correct in their judgment of the world about them, contemporary history proves abundantly. That they were correct likewise in believing that some fearful judgment was about to fall on men. It proved by the fact that it did fall, and that the first half of the first century saw not only the sack of Rome, but the conquest and desolation of the greater part of civilized world, amid bloodshed, misery, and misrule, which seemed to turn Europe into chaos, which would have turned into a chaos, and there not be a few men left but still felt it possible and necessary to believe in God and to work righteousness. Under these terrible forebodings, men began to flee from a doomed world and try to be alone with God, and by any means they might save each man his own soul in that dread day. Others, not Christians, had done the same before them. Among all the eastern nations, men had appeared from time to time to whom the things seen were but a passing phantom. The things unseen, like only true and eternal realities, who tormented alike by the awfulness of the infinite unknown, and by the pretty cares and low passions of the finite mortal life, which they knew but too well, had determined to renounce the latter, that they may give themselves up to solving the riddle of the former, and be at peace and free, and at least from tyranny and from their own selves. 800 years before St. Anthony fled into the desert, that young Hindu Raja, who men call Buddha now, had fled into the forest, leaving wives and kingdoms to find rest for his soul. He denounced caste, he preached poverty, asceticism, self annihilation. He found a religion like that of the old hermits, democratic, ascetic, with its convents, saints, worships, pilgrimages, miraculous relics, rosaries, and much more, which strangely anticipates the monastic religion. And his followers to this day are more numerous than those of any other creed. Brahmins too had given themselves up to penance and mortification till they believed themselves able, like Kehana, to have gained by self-torture the right to command, not naturally, not nature barely, but the gods themselves. Among the Jews, the essence of the Dead Sea and the Therapeuti in Egypt have formed ascetic communities, the former more practical, the latter more contemplative. But both alike agree in the purpose of escaping from the world into a life of poverty and simplicity, piety and virtue. And among the countless philosophic sects of Asia, known to ecclesiastical writing has heretics, more than one had professed, and double less often practiced the same abstraction from the world, the same contempt of the flesh. The very Neo-Platonism of Alexandria, while they deride the Christian asceticism and found themselves forced to affect, like the Apples of Apatia, a sentimental and Pharisaic asceticism of their own. This phase of sight and feelings, so strange to us now, was common, nay, primeval among the Easterns. The day was come when it should pass from the east into the west, and Egypt, the mother of wonders, the parents of so much civilization and philosophy, both Greek and Roman, the halfway resting place to which not merely the merchandise but the wisdom of the East had for centuries passed into the Roman Empire, a land more ill governed too, and more miserable, in spite of the fertility, because more defenseless and effeminate than most other Roman possessions, was a country in which naturally and it were of hereditary right such a movement would first appear. According it was discovered about the end of the 4th century that the mountains of the desert of Egypt were full of Christian men who had fled out of the dying world in the hope of attaining everlasting life. Wonderful things were told of their courage, their abstinence, their miracles, and of their virtues also, of the purity, the humility, the helpfulness, and charity to each other and to all. They call each other, it was said, brothers, and they live up to the sacred name forgotten, if ever known by the rest of the Roman Empire, like the apostolic Christians in the first fervor of their conversion. They had all things in common. They lived at peace with each other, under a mild and charitable rule, and kept literally those commands of Christ which all the rest of the world explain away to nothing. The news spread, it chimed, and with all that it was best, as well as with much that was questionable in the public mind. The men could be brothers, that they could live without the luxury, the tasteless and often brutal amusements, the low sensuality, the base intrigue, the bloody warfare which was the accepted lot of many, that they could find time to look steadfastly at heaven and hell as awful realities, which must be faced some day, which have best faced at once. This just as much as curiosity about their alleged miracles, and the selfish longing to revival them in superhuman powers, led many of the most virtuous and the most learned men of the time to visit them and ascertain the truth. Jerome, Rufinus, Evagrius, Sulpicius, Severus went to see them, undergoing on the way the severest toils and dangers, and brought back reports of mingled truth and falsehood, specimens on which will be seen in this page. Traveling in those days was labor, if not of necessity, then surely of love. Palladius, for instance, found it impossible to visit the upper Thebaid and the Sigyn, and the infinite multitude of monks whose fashion of life no one will believe, for they surpass human life, who to this day raise the dead and walk upon the waters like Peter, and whosoever the Saviour did by the holy apostles, he does now by them. But because it would be very dangerous if he went beyond Legco, like Propolis, on account of the inroad road of robbers, he could not see those things. The holy men and women of whom he wrote, he said he did not see without extreme toil. 7 times he and his companions were nearly lost. Once they walked through the desert 5 days and nights, and were almost worn out by hunger and thirst. Again they felt on rough marches, where the sedge pierced their feet and caused intolerable pain, while they were almost killed with the cold. Another time they stuck in the mud up to their waist, and cried with David, I have come into the deep mire, where no ground is. Another time they waded for 4 days through the flood of the Nile by path almost swept away. Another time they met robbers on the seashore coming to Glaucus and were chased by them for 10 miles. Another time they were all but upset and drowned in the crossing the Nile. Another time in the marches of Marotis, where paper grows, they were cast on a little desert island and remained 3 days and nights in the open air, amid great cold and shower, for it was a season of Epiphany. The 8th peril, he said, is hardly worth mentioning, but once, when they went to Nitria, they came on a great hollow in which many crocodiles had remained. When the waters retired from the field, 3 of them lay along the bank, And the monks went up to them, thinking them dead, before the crocodiles rushed at them. But when they called loudly on the Lord, the monsters, the monsters, as if turned away by an angel, shut themselves in the water, while they ran out to Nitra, meditating on the word of Job. 7 times shall he deliver them from trouble, and in the eighth they shall no evil touch thee. The great the great Saint Athanasius, fleeing from persecution, had taken the refuge among these monks. He carried the report of their virtues to the thieves in Gaul, and wrote a life of Antony, the person on which was a main agent in the conversion of Saint Augustine. Hilarion, a remarkable personage whose history will be told hereafter, carried their report and their example likewise into Palestine, and from the time of Judea, desolate and seemingly accursed by the sin of the Jewish people, became once more the Holy Land, the place of pilgrimage, whose ruins, whose very soil, were kept sacred by hermits, the guardians of the footsteps of Christ. In Rome itself, the news produced an effect which, to the thoughtful mind, is altogether tragical in its nobleness. The Roman aristocracy was deprived of all political power. It had been decimated too, with horrible and cruelty, only 1 generation before, by Valentinian and his satellites, on the charges of profligacy, treason, and magic. Merely rich men, they still linger on the idleness and luxury, without art, science, true civilization of any kind, followed by long trains of slaves, punishing a servant with 300 stripes if he were too long in bringing hot water, weighing the fish or birds or dumplings put on their tables, while secretaries stood by with tables to record all, hating learning as they hated poison, indulging at the bath in conduct which had best be left undescribed, and complaining that they were not born among the seminarians, and if amid their golden fans a fly should perch upon the silken fringes, or a slender ray of the sun should pierce throughout the awning, while if they go any distance to see their estates in the country, to hunt at the meeting collected for the amusement by others, they think that they have equalled the marches of Alexander or Caesar, and the wives, widows, and daughters of men of this stamp, and not half their effeminacy and baseness, as the honest rough old soldiers Arminius Marcellinus described it, has been told here. The news brought from Egypt work with wondrous potency. Women of the highest rank awoke suddenly to the discovery that life was given them for another purpose, that of frivolous and enjoyment, and tawdry and vanity, despising themselves, despising the husbands to whom they had been wedded in loveless marriages, the covenants whose infidelities they had too often to endure. They too fled from a world which had sated and sickened them. They freed their slaves, gave away their wealth to found hospitals and to feed the poor, and in voluntary poverty and mean garments they followed such men as Jerome and Rufinus across the sea, to visit the new found saints of the Egyptian desert, and to end their days in some cases in delightful monasteries in Palestine. The lives of such women, of those of the Addition house, the lives of Marcella and Furia, of Paula, of the Melanias, and the rest is not my task to write. They must be told by a woman, not by a man. We may blame those ladies, if we will, for neglecting their duties. We may sneer, if we will, at the weakness and the aristocratic pride, the spiritual vanity which we fancy that we discover. We may lament, and in that we shall not be wrong, the influence which such men as Jerome obtain over them, the example and persecutor of so much, while as seen then being ruinous to the family and social life, but must confess that the fault lay not with the ladies themselves, but with their fathers' husbands. And we must confess that in this woman the spirit of the old Roman matrons, which seems to have been so long dead, flashed up for one splendid moment, ere it sunk into the darkness of the Middle Ages. And then woman asserted, however strangely and fantastically, her moral equality with men, and that at the very moment when monasticism was consigning her to contempt, almost to abhorrence, as the noxious animal, the fragile vessel. The cause of man fall at first, and all his sins and misery ever since woman showed amongst to his naive confessed surprise, that she would dare and suffer and adore as well as he. But the movement having once seized the Roman Empire grew and spread irresistibly. It was accepted, supported, preached, practiced by every great man of the time. Athanasius, Basil, Chrysostom, Gregory of Narsisum, in the East, Jerome, Augustine, Rufus, Evagrius, Fulgentus, Suppius, Severus, Vincent of Larines, John Cassian, Martin of Tours, Salvian, Ciceros of Harlem, were all monks, as much of monks as their duties allowed them to be. Ambrose of Milan, although no monk himself, was the fervent preacher or the careful legislator for monasticism, male and female, throughout the whole Roman Empire. In the course of a century had spread hermits and dwellers in the desert, anchorites, retired from the world, or monks dwellers alone. The three names grew afterwards to designate three different orders of asceticism. The hermits remained through the Middle Ages, those who dwelt in the desert. The anchorite, or anchors, of the English Middle Ages seem generally to have inhabited cells built in or near the church walls. The name of monks was transferred from those who dwelt alone to those who dwelt in regular communities under a fixed government. But the three names at first were interchangeable. The three models of life alternated often in the same man. The life of all three was the same: celibacy, poverty, and good deeds towards their fellow men, self-restraint, and sometimes self-torture of every kind, to atone, as far as might be, for the sins committed after baptism. And the mental food of all three was the same alike: continued meditation upon the vanity of the world, the sinfulness of the flesh, the glories of heaven, and the horrors of hell. But with this, the old hermits combined, to do them justice, a personal faith in God and a personal love for Christ, which those sneered at them would do well to copy. Overall, Europe, even to Ireland, the same pattern of Christianity excellence repeated itself with a strange regularity, till it became the only received pattern, and to enter religion or to be converted meant simply to become a monk. Of the authentic biographies of certain, there is and this page, which is page 19 of the introduction, there is an important quote that it says, "The Celtic Irish Church seems to have been no other pattern. The hermits who became abbots with their monks were the only teachers of the people, and had almost said that the only Christians were as early as the 6th century, if not the 5th. They and their disciples of Iona and Scotland derived their peculiar tonsure, their use of bells, their eastern mode of keeping their Paschal feast, and other peculiarities seemingly without the intervention of Rome, is a mystery still unsolved." Okay, a few specimens also given to this volume. If they shall seem to have any reader income or even absurd, he must remember that they are the only existing and the generally contemporaneous histories of men who exercised for 300 years an enormous influence over the world of Christendom, who exercise a vast influence over the greater part of it to this day. There are the biographies of men who were regarded during their lives and after their death as divine and inspired prophets, whose were worshipped with boundless trust and admiration by the millions of human beings. Their fame and power were not created by the priesthood. The priesthood rather leaned on them than they on it. They occupy a post analogous to that of the old Jewish prophets, always independent of, sometimes opposed to the regular clergy, and dependent altogether on public opinions and the surveys of the multitude. When Christianity, after 3 centuries of repression and persecution, emerged, triumphed as the creed of the whole civilization world, it has become that their lives describe the motto of the religious life for the 5th century. It remained a motto for succeeding centuries, and the lives of Saint Anthony and his compeers were founded that the whole literature of saintly biographies, the whole popular conception of the universe and the man's relations to it, the whole science and demonology with its peculiar literature, the peculiar system of criminal jurisprudence, and their influence did not ease at the Reformation among Protestant divines. The influence of these lives of the Hermits Fathers is much traceable even to the style and language. In the Pilgrim's Progress and the last papal allegation, the great hermit of Egypt were not merely the founders of the vast monastic system which influenced the whole political and wars and social life, and well as the whole religion of the Middle Age. They were a school of philosophers, as they rightly call themselves, who altered the whole current of human thought. Those who wish for general notions of the men and their time will find all that they require set forth from different points of view and with the same honesty and learning. In Gibbon, the M. de Montalembert's Moises Occident, in Den Milben, the histories of Christianity, the Latin Christianity, and the Osnan Edutus Germanicus. But the truest notion of the man is to be God, after all. From the original documents, and especially from the curious collections of them by the Jesuits, Rowendell, commonly known as the Lives of the Hermits Fathers. After the acquaintance of now 25 years with this wonderful treasure of early Christian mythology, to which all fairy tales are due and mingled, I have almost inclined to sympathize with the Montalbert's questions: who is so ignorant or so unfortunate as not to have devoured these tales of the heroic age of monarchism? Okay, so basically, there's an important here in page 21 says the book in which from his daring of present problems will deserve translation. So this was published in 1628. Okay, so we continue. Was not contemplated, if not with the eyes of faith, at least with the admiration inspired by an uncontrollable greatness of soul, the struggle of these athletes of penance. Everything is to be found there: variety of battles, the sublime and the simple epic of a race of men, naives as children and strong as giants. In whatever else once may differ from M. de Montalbert, it is always painful to differ from one whose pen has been always the faithful servant of virtue and piety, purity and chivalry, loyalty and liberty, and whose generous appreciation of England and the English is the more honorable to him, by reason of an utter divergence in opinion, which is less wide and noble spirit produces only antipathy. One must at least agree with him in his estimate of the importance of these lives of the fathers, not only to the ecclesiologists, but to the psychologists and the historians. Their influence and subtle often transform and modify again and again, but still potent from his very subtleties is being felt around us in many a puzzle, educational, social, and political, and promises to be felt still more during the coming generations. And to have studied throughout one of them, said the life of Saint Anthony by Athanasius, is to have had in our hands, whether we know it or not, the key of many a lock, which just now refuses either to be tampered with or burst open. I have determined, therefore, to give a few of these lives translations as literally as possible, so the reader will then have no reason to fear a grable or partial account of the personages so difficult to conceive or understand. He will be able to see the men as wholes, to judge according to his light of their merits and their defects. The very style of the biographies, which is copied as literally as is compatible with English tongue, will teach him, if he be wise, somewhat of the temper and habits of throughout the ages in which they live. And one of these original documents, which is honestly his vivid tone of contemporary matters as intense earnestness, will give perhaps a more true picture of the whole hermit movement than, with all respect to be said, the most brilliant general panorama. It is impossible to give in this series all the lives of all the early hermits, even of those contained in Rosewade. This volume will contain, therefore, only the most important and the most famous lives of the Egyptians, Syrians, Persians hermits, followed by perhaps by a few later biographies from the Western Europe, as proofs that the hermit type, as it spread towards the Atlantic, remains still the same as the Egyptian desert. Again, One modern mistake the reader must be warned that theory, namely that these biographies were written as a religious romances, edifying but not historical, to be admired but not to believe, but not believed. There is not the slightest evidence that such was the case. The lives of this is most other saints, certainly those in this volume, were written by men who believed the stories themselves after such inquiry into the facts as they deemed necessary. Who knew that others would believe them, and who intended that they should do so, and the stories were believed according to and take as matter of fact for the most practical purpose of the whole of Christendom. The forging of miracles, like the forging of character for the honor, practical trying, or the advantages of a particular monastery, belong to a much later and much worse age. And whatsoever we many may think of the taste of the author of those lives, or of their faculty for judging of evidence, we must at least give them credit for being earnest men, incapable of what should have been in their eyes and ought to be in ours, not merely falsehood, but impiety. Let the readers be sure for this, that these documents should not have exercised their enormous influence on the human mind had there not been in them the under whatever accidents of credulity, even absurdity, element of sincerity, virtue, and nobility. This is the end of the introduction book of the Hermits.